In the year 1206, a man rose from the steppes of Mongolia to become history's most feared conqueror. But behind the military genius and the vast empire that stretched from sunrise to sunset lies a legacy written in blood, tears, and unspeakable suffering. What you are about to witness is not the romanticized tale of conquest found in history books, but the forgotten screams of millions whose stories were buried beneath the hoofbeats of Mongol horses. These are the crimes of Genghis Khan that history tried to forget, acts so cruel that even hardened warriors of his time recoiled in horror. The Mongol Empire, at its zenith, controlled over 12 million square miles of territory, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Yet this achievement was built upon a foundation of systematic brutality that would make even the most violent modern dictators appear merciful by comparison. Conservative estimates suggest that Genghis Khan's campaigns resulted in the deaths of 40 million people, roughly 11% of the world's population at that time. But these numbers tell only part of the story. Behind each statistic was a human being who suffered, who had dreams, who loved and was loved, and whose life was extinguished in ways that defy comprehension. Born as Temujin around 1162, the man who would become Genghis Khan emerged from a childhood marked by violence and betrayal. His father was poisoned when he was 9, his family was cast out by their tribe, and he would later kill his own half-brother over food. These early experiences shaped a worldview where mercy was weakness and cruelty was survival. When he united the Mongol tribes and took the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, he brought with him not just military innovation, but a philosophy of warfare that viewed terror as the ultimate weapon. The Mongol war machine was unlike anything the world had seen. Each warrior controlled multiple horses, allowing them to cover vast distances at unprecedented speeds. They employed Chinese siege engineers, Muslim administrators, and European craftsmen, creating a multicultural engine of destruction. But what truly set them apart was not their composite bows or their tactical brilliance. It was their willingness to employ cruelty as a calculated tool of psychological warfare. Cities that resisted faced not just defeat, but complete annihilation. Their populations subjected to tortures designed to send a message that would echo across continents. What makes Genghis Khan's crimes particularly chilling is their systematic nature. This was not the random violence of a barbarian horde, but the calculated brutality of a sophisticated military machine. Orders for massacre were given with the same cold efficiency as orders for troop movements. The Mongols developed specific protocols for the destruction of cities, the categorization of prisoners, and the distribution of captured women among the troops. They even had mathematical formulas for determining how many people to kill to achieve maximum psychological impact on neighboring territories. Sexual violence was not a byproduct of Mongol conquest. It was a central strategy. Genghis Khan himself is estimated to have fathered hundreds, possibly thousands of children through both his wives and the countless women he took as concubines. Genetic studies suggest that 0.5% of the male population worldwide, about 16 million men, are direct descendants of Genghis Khan. This staggering number represents not a testament to virility, but evidence of systematic rape on an industrial scale. Women from conquered territories were sorted like livestock, with the most beautiful reserved for Khan and his generals, while others were distributed among soldiers or sold into slavery. The trauma inflicted by these campaigns rippled through generations. Entire civilizations were psychologically scarred, their cultural memories forever marked by the Mongol terror. Persian historians wrote of fields white with bones and rivers running red with blood. Chinese chroniclers documented cities where not even dogs or chickens were left alive. Russian accounts speak of winters where the frozen corpses of massacre victims were stacked like cordwood outside city walls. These were not exaggerations, but desperate attempts to document a horror that seemed beyond human comprehension. As we delve into these 6 specific crimes, remember that each represents not an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior that was repeated across continents and decades. These are stories that were deliberately suppressed, minimized, or rationalized by historians who preferred to focus on the Mongols' contributions to trade and cultural exchange. But the victims deserve to have their stories told, their suffering acknowledged, and their humanity restored to the historical record. What follows is not easy to hear, but it is necessary to understand the true cost of empire and the depths of human cruelty when power goes unchecked. The first and perhaps most horrifying of Genghis Khan's systematic crimes was the complete annihilation of the Khwarezmian Empire between 1219 and 1221. This was not merely conquest but deliberate genocide that erased one of the most advanced civilizations of the medieval world. The Khwarezmian Empire, spanning modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, was a center of learning, trade, and culture. Its cities housed libraries, universities, and architectural wonders that had taken centuries to build. Within 2 years, this entire civilization was reduced to smoldering ruins and bleached bones. The catalyst for this apocalypse was a diplomatic incident. The governor of Otrar, a Khwarezmian border city, executed a Mongol trade caravan of 450 merchants and confiscated their goods, suspecting them of being spies. When Genghis Khan sent 3 envoys to demand justice, Shah Muhammad II killed one and sent the others back with their beards burned off, a grave insult in Mongol culture. This diplomatic failure would cost millions of lives. Genghis Khan's response was not proportionate justice, but complete extermination. He reportedly climbed a mountain to commune with the sky god Tengri, emerging with what he claimed was divine mandate for total war. The invasion began in 1219 with an army of 200,000 Mongols crossing the Tian Shan Mountains in winter, a feat considered impossible by military experts of the time. They divided into multiple columns, striking simultaneously at different points to prevent coordinated defense. The first major city to fall was Otrar itself, where the governor who had sparked the conflict held out for 5 months. When the city finally fell, molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears while he still lived, a death that took hours of unimaginable agony. But this was merciful compared to what befell the city's population. At Otrar, the Mongols introduced a practice they would repeat throughout the campaign: the complete separation and systematic murder of the population. Men, women, and children were driven onto the plain outside the city and divided into groups. Soldiers were assigned quotas. Each Mongol warrior was responsible for executing a specific number of civilians, typically between 24 and 50 people. To ensure no one survived by feigning death, the Mongols would return days later to decapitate all corpses. Artisans and young women were separated for slavery, but even this apparent mercy was cruel. Many would later envy the dead. The city of Urgench, the Khwarezmian capital, suffered an even worse fate. After a 7-month siege that cost the Mongols more casualties than any other battle in the campaign, Genghis Khan ordered the complete destruction of the city. The Mongols diverted the Amu Darya River to flood Urgench, drowning thousands who had taken shelter in basements and underground passages. Those who survived the flood were methodically hunted down and killed. Contemporary accounts state that each Mongol soldier was assigned the execution of 24 citizens, and with 50,000 Mongol troops participating, the death toll reached 1.2 million, though some historians consider this number inflated. But it was at Nishapur where the Mongols demonstrated the true depths of their cruelty. This city had particular significance. Genghis Khan's beloved son-in-law, Tokchar, had been killed there by an arrow. In revenge, Khan gave control of the assault to Tokchar's widow, his daughter. She ordered that every living thing in the city be killed, not just humans but all animals, down to the cats and dogs. The Mongols spent days systematically executing the population, then built pyramids from the severed heads, separate piles for men, women, and children. Persian historians recorded that 1.7 million skulls were counted, though modern scholars suggest the actual number was likely hundreds of thousands. The destruction of Merv represents perhaps the single bloodiest massacre in human history. This city, known as the Pearl of the East, was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population estimated at over 700,000. The Mongols spent 13 days killing every inhabitant. They used a horrifyingly efficient method. The population was brought to the plain in groups, forced to lie down, and then executed by having their necks broken or being shot with arrows. To ensure completeness, the Mongols pretended to leave, then returned to kill those who had emerged from hiding. They repeated this process 3 times. A Persian historian who visited Merv shortly after reported counting over 1.3 million corpses. The psychological warfare extended beyond mere killing. In many cities, the Mongols forced family members to execute each other, parents compelled to kill their children before being killed themselves. They would promise mercy to those who revealed hidden valuables or secret passages, only to execute them anyway, after extracting the information. Young women were raped in front of their families before being distributed among the soldiers. The trauma was so severe that survivors often lost the ability to speak, wandering as mute witnesses to horror beyond language. The complete destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire eliminated centuries of Persian Islamic civilization, destroying libraries, irrigation systems, and architectural treasures that would never be rebuilt. The second great crime that history has tried to forget is the systematic use of human shields and biological warfare during the Mongol conquests. While military historians often praise Genghis Khan's tactical innovations, they frequently omit his pioneering use of captured civilians as expendable weapons of war. This practice, refined over decades of conquest, transformed innocent people into unwilling participants in their own people's destruction. The Mongols didn't just kill civilians, they weaponized them, turning human suffering into a tactical advantage that would horrify even seasoned warriors of the age. The practice began during the early campaigns in northern China, where the Mongols faced fortified cities with walls too strong for their traditional cavalry tactics. Genghis Khan ordered that prisoners from previously conquered settlements be driven ahead of his armies during sieges. These human shields, called hashar, included elderly men, women and children who were forced at sword point to fill moats with dirt and stones, all while under fire from their own countrymen defending the walls. Chinese chroniclers recorded the agonizing dilemma of defenders who had to choose between shooting arrows at their own families or allowing the Mongols to breach their defenses. At the siege of Zhongdu, modern Beijing, in 1215, the Mongols perfected this tactic to nightmarish efficiency. They gathered tens of thousands of Chinese peasants from the surrounding countryside and forced them to march ahead of the Mongol army, carrying ladders and siege equipment. These civilians were given no food or water and were expected to assault the walls until they died. Those who tried to flee were immediately killed by Mongol archers stationed behind them. Those who moved forward faced the arrows and boiling oil of the defenders. Contemporary accounts describe fields carpeted with bodies, creating ramps of corpses that the Mongols eventually used to scale the walls. But Genghis Khan's cruelty evolved beyond using living shields. During the siege of Kaffa in 1347, though after Khan's death but following his established practices, the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses over city walls, one of the first recorded uses of biological warfare. This tactic had been developed during Khan's lifetime, when the Mongols would collect bodies of those who died from disease and use them to contaminate water supplies or spread illness in besieged cities. At Nishapur, they had thrown diseased animal carcasses into wells, ensuring that even survivors would face death by plague or poisoned water. The Mongols also pioneered the use of psychological biological warfare. After conquering a city ravaged by disease, they would force infected survivors to travel to the next target, spreading both plague and panic. They understood that fear of disease could be as powerful as the disease itself. Cities would empty as refugees fled, spreading both contagion and terror tales across trade routes. This created a cascade effect, where entire regions would be depopulated not just by direct Mongol action, but by the diseases and famines that followed in their wake. Perhaps most disturbing was the Mongol practice of forced fratricide during sieges. When attacking cities, they would capture refugees fleeing the area and sort them by their relationships. Fathers would be forced to throw their sons at the city walls as human projectiles from catapults. Brothers would be given weapons and commanded to fight each other to the death, with the promise that the victor would be spared, a promise rarely kept. Mothers were forced to choose which of their children would be immediately executed and which would be enslaved. These acts served no military purpose beyond breaking the human spirit and demonstrating that the Mongols recognized no bonds of humanity. The environmental warfare practiced by the Mongols created suffering that lasted generations. In Central Asia, they systematically destroyed ancient irrigation systems called khanats that had taken centuries to build and were essential for agriculture in arid regions. Without these underground channels, fertile lands reverted to desert, and populations that had thrived for millennia were forced to abandon their ancestral homes. In northern China, they destroyed dams and redirected rivers to flood agricultural areas, creating famines that killed millions who had survived the initial conquests. Some regions didn't recover their pre-Mongol population levels for over 500 years. The use of human shields reached its grotesque zenith during the Western campaigns. At the Battle of Mohi in Hungary in 1241, the Mongols drove thousands of captured Polish and German prisoners ahead of their army. These prisoners were chained together in groups, making escape impossible, and were forced to absorb the initial charge of Hungarian heavy cavalry. European knights, trained in chivalric warfare, were psychologically unprepared for tactics that used their own people as weapons against them. One Hungarian chronicler wrote that the screams of the dying prisoners were so loud that orders could not be heard over the din, contributing to the total collapse of European resistance. The third horror in our examination of Genghis Khan's cruelty is the systematic sexual slavery and forced breeding programs that the Mongols implemented across their empire. This was not the random violence of undisciplined soldiers, but an organized system of sexual exploitation that operated with bureaucratic efficiency. Women from conquered territories were catalogued, distributed, and traded like any other commodity of war. The scale and systematic nature of this sexual violence created generational trauma that altered the genetic and cultural landscape of entire continents. When a city fell to the Mongols, one of the first acts was the separation of the population by gender and age. Young women and girls were lined up for inspection, sorted by their perceived beauty and age. The most attractive were reserved for Genghis Khan and his senior commanders, who maintained harems of hundreds or even thousands of women. Khan himself was reported to have a new woman brought to his gyre tent every night, selected from this vast collection of captives. Those not chosen for the elite were distributed among officers according to rank, with common soldiers receiving women as part of their share of plunder. The selection process itself was designed to maximize humiliation and terror. Women were forced to disrobe in public, examined like livestock for physical defects, and sorted into categories. Virgins commanded the highest value and were often subjected to physical examinations to verify their status. Mothers were separated from their children, wives from husbands, sisters from brothers. The Mongols understood that breaking family bonds was essential to preventing organized resistance. They would often force male family members to watch the selection process, killing any who protested or showed emotion. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was the Mongol breeding program. Genghis Khan explicitly viewed the widespread rape of conquered women as a means of spreading Mongol bloodlines and creating a biological legacy that would outlast his empire. He encouraged his soldiers to impregnate as many women as possible, seeing mixed-blood offspring as a way to pacify conquered territories through genetic assimilation. This was not a byproduct of conquest, but a deliberate policy of genetic imperialism. DNA studies have confirmed the horrifying success of this program. An estimated 16 million men alive today carry Genghis Khan's Y chromosome, testament to the industrial scale of sexual violence. The fate of these women after capture was uniformly horrific. Those in the Khan's personal harem lived in luxurious captivity, but were essentially breeding slaves, valued only for their ability to produce offspring. When they aged or fell from favor, they were often given to lower-ranking soldiers or sold in slave markets. Many were forced to follow the Mongol armies on campaign, suffering repeated rapes while enduring the harsh conditions of constant military movement. Suicide was so common among these captives that the Mongols instituted constant surveillance and physical restraints to prevent women from killing themselves. The Mongols also instituted a system of sexual tribute from vassal states. Conquered rulers were required to send a specified number of young women to the Mongol court each year, typically their most beautiful daughters of nobility. The Goryeo Kingdom of Korea, for instance, was forced to provide hundreds of women annually for over 80 years. These women, known as Kongnyo, tribute women, were selected from the highest families, creating a situation where the elite of conquered nations were forced to offer their own daughters to their conquerors. The psychological impact on these societies, knowing that their daughters could be taken at any time, created a perpetual state of humiliation and fear. Even Genghis Khan's own family was marked by sexual violence. His wife Berta was kidnapped and raped by a rival tribe early in their marriage, and the paternity of their eldest son Yochi remained in question throughout his life. Rather than creating empathy, this experience seems to have normalized sexual violence in Khan's worldview. He instituted laws that made all women in conquered territories the property of their conquerors, legally codifying rape as a right of conquest. The Yasa, the Mongol legal code, specifically outlined how captured women should be distributed, creating a legal framework for systematic sexual slavery. The trauma inflicted on these women extended far beyond the initial assault. Many were forced to bear and raise the children of their rapists, living reminders of their subjugation. In many cultures, these women were considered dishonored and were rejected by their own communities if they ever managed to escape or were freed. The children born of these rapes often faced discrimination from both Mongol and conquered societies, belonging fully to neither world. Entire generations grew up marked by the circumstances of their conception, creating cascading cycles of trauma that persisted for centuries after the Mongol armies had passed. The fourth atrocity that reveals the depths of Genghis Khan's depravity was the complete extermination of the Tangut Kingdom, a deliberate genocide carried out as Khan's final act of vengeance. The Tangut people, who called themselves the Minyag and their kingdom Shishia, had created a sophisticated Buddhist civilization in what is now northwestern China. They had developed their own writing system, maintained extensive libraries, and served as crucial intermediaries on the Silk Road. By 1227, this entire civilization would be erased so thoroughly that their written language wouldn't be deciphered again until the 20th century. The roots of this genocide lay in what Genghis Khan perceived as betrayal. The Tangut Kingdom had submitted to Mongol suzerainty in 1210, agreeing to provide troops and tribute. However, when Khan demanded Tangut forces for his campaign against Khwarezm in 1219, the Tangut Emperor refused, reportedly saying that if Genghis Khan didn't have enough troops, he had no business being a conqueror. This refusal festered in Khan's mind for years. Even as he conquered vast swathes of Central Asia and Persia, he planned his revenge against the Tanguts. In 1226, Despite being over 60 years old and in declining health, he personally led what would be his final campaign. The Mongol invasion of the Tangut Kingdom was marked by unprecedented savagery, even by Mongol standards. Genghis Khan issued explicit orders that no Tangut was to be spared. Not nobles, not peasants, not monks, not children. This was to be a complete erasure of a people. The campaign began with the systematic destruction of the Tangut countryside. The Mongols destroyed the complex irrigation systems that made agriculture possible in this arid region, ensuring that even if some Tangut survived, they would face starvation. They burned libraries and monasteries, specifically targeting repositories of Tangut culture and Buddhist texts. The siege of the Tangut capital, Yinchuan, lasted 6 months. During this time, Genghis Khan, despite suffering from what historians believe was a severe injury from a fall from his horse, personally oversaw the systematic torture of captured Tanguts. He ordered that prisoners be slowly dismembered in view of the city walls, their screams carrying to the defenders. Children were impaled on spears and raised as standards. The Mongols built towers from severed heads, creating a landscape of death that surrounded the besieged city. When the city finally fell in 1227, the massacre that followed was absolute. What makes the Tangut genocide particularly significant is that Genghis Khan was dying as it unfolded. Historical accounts suggest he was suffering from either injuries, illness, or possibly both. Yet even on his deathbed, his primary concern was ensuring the complete extermination of the Tanguts. He issued final orders that after his death, which he knew was imminent, the destruction of the Tanguts should continue until none remained. His last recorded words included specific instructions that the Tangut royal family should be executed after surrendering, despite having negotiated terms of surrender, a final act of treachery. The execution of the Tangut emperor and his family was conducted with elaborate cruelty. After accepting their surrender and promising them safe passage, the Mongols waited until Genghis Khan died in August 1227, then systematically murdered the entire royal line. The emperor was forced to watch as his children were killed one by one, then his wives, before he himself was slowly strangled. The Mongols then hunted down anyone with even distant connections to the royal bloodline, ensuring that no one could ever claim legitimacy to restore the Tangut kingdom. The thoroughness of the Tangut extermination was unprecedented. The Mongols conducted systematic sweeps of the entire kingdom, dividing the territory into sections and methodically killing every inhabitant. They developed a grid system, marking off areas as they were cleansed to ensure no region was missed. Mongol units would return to areas multiple times, killing any survivors who had emerged from hiding. They poisoned wells, burned grain stores, and slaughtered all livestock to ensure that even those who initially escaped would die of thirst or starvation. Contemporary Chinese historians estimated that of a population of several million Tanguts, fewer than 100,000 survived, scattered and absorbed into other populations. The cultural genocide was equally complete. The Mongols made a deliberate effort to destroy every trace of Tangut civilization. They burned all texts written in the Tangut script, destroyed artwork, demolished architectural monuments, and killed scholars and monks who were the repositories of oral traditions. The destruction was so complete that when archaeologists discovered Tangut texts in the 20th century, there were no living traditions to help decode them. An entire civilization's intellectual and cultural heritage was erased in a matter of months. The Tangut genocide stands as perhaps the most successful ethnic cleansing in pre-modern history. A people who had existed for centuries simply ceased to exist. The fifth crime against humanity perpetrated by Genghis Khan was the systematic destruction of Baghdad and the obliteration of the Islamic Golden Age, though this was completed by his grandson Hulagu, following the methods and philosophy established by the great Khan. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 represents not just the destruction of a city, but the deliberate extinguishment of one of humanity's greatest centers of learning and culture. The House of Wisdom, which had preserved and expanded human knowledge for 500 years, was thrown into the Tigris River, its centuries of accumulated scholarship turning the waters black with ink for days. Baghdad in the 13th century was arguably the most sophisticated city on earth. It housed the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual center of Sunni Islam, and was home to over 1 million people. The city contained dozens of libraries, schools of mathematics and astronomy, hospitals that were centuries ahead of their European counterparts, and gardens that were considered wonders of the world. The House of Wisdom alone contained works from Greek, Persian, Indian and Chinese scholars, translated and preserved nowhere else. Philosophers, poets, mathematicians and physicians from across the known world came to Baghdad to study and teach. The Mongol approach to Baghdad followed the template of terror established by Genghis Khan. When Caliph al-Mustasim refused to surrender, Hulagu Khan assembled the largest Mongol army ever fielded, estimated at 150,000 warriors, supplemented by Chinese siege engineers, Armenian and Georgian Christian auxiliaries eager for revenge against Muslim rule, and thousands of forced laborers. The siege began in January 1258. The Mongols surrounded the city completely, building a palisade and ditch that prevented any escape. They then began a psychological campaign, catapulting severed heads into the city and allowing refugees from previously destroyed towns to enter Baghdad to spread tales of Mongol atrocities. When Baghdad's walls were breached on February 10, 1258, what followed was one of the most thorough massacres in recorded history. The Mongols had specific orders to spare no one except Christians and Jews who could prove their faith, though even many of these were killed in the frenzy. The slaughter continued for a full week. Contemporary accounts describe the Mongols methodically going house to house, room by room, killing every inhabitant. They would seal buildings and set them afire, burning alive those hiding inside. The streets became so choked with corpses that the Mongols had to climb over piles of bodies to continue their killing. The death toll at Baghdad defies comprehension. Conservative estimates place it at 200,000, while contemporary Muslim sources claim up to 2 million were killed. Likely an exaggeration, but indicative of the scale of devastation. The Mongols forced scholars to carry the books from libraries before executing them. They made special sport of killing Islamic clergy, forcing them to eat pork and drink wine before their execution, violating their religious beliefs in their final moments. The grand mosques were turned into stables, their mihrab used as feeding troughs, the Qurans burned for warmth. The execution of Caliph al-Mustasim was designed to send a message to the entire Islamic world. The Mongols, following their superstition about spilling royal blood on the ground, wrapped the caliph in a carpet and had horses trample him to death. But before this, they forced him to watch the execution of his entire family. His sons were killed in front of him, his daughters and wives distributed among Mongol commanders. They then locked him in his own treasury without food or water, mockingly telling him to eat his gold. After his death by trampling, his body was left to rot in public, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam reduced to carrion. The cultural destruction was as devastating as the human toll. The Mongols systematically destroyed Baghdad's irrigation system, canals that had functioned since ancient Babylonian times. Without these, the surrounding agricultural land reverted to desert. They threw entire libraries into the Tigris River, so many books that survivors reported one could walk across the river on the floating volumes. Philosophical works, medical texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations accumulated over centuries, all destroyed in days. Survivors spoke of the Tigris running black with ink for 6 months. The loss to human knowledge was incalculable. Medical procedures, mathematical proofs, astronomical observations, technological innovations, lost forever. The destruction of Baghdad created a trauma in the Islamic world that persists to this day. The city that had been the jewel of Islamic civilization never recovered its former glory. The irrigation systems were never fully rebuilt, the libraries never restocked, the schools of learning never reopened. The psychological impact was equally profound. The fall of the caliphate shattered the Islamic world's confidence and unity. Some historians argue that the Islamic world's turn toward conservatism and its eventual eclipse by European powers can be traced directly to the trauma of Baghdad's destruction. The Mongols had not just destroyed a city, they had extinguished a light of human civilization that had burned for half a millennium. The sixth and perhaps most personally cruel of Genghis Khan's crimes was his treatment of betrayal within his own ranks and among former allies. While history often focuses on his destruction of enemies, the fate of those who betrayed his trust reveals a sadistic creativity in punishment that went beyond mere execution. These elaborate tortures were designed not just to kill, but to create suffering so memorable that the stories would be retold for generations, ensuring that no one would ever consider betraying a Mongol Khan again. The case of Jamukha, Genghis Khan's blood brother turned rival, illustrates this perfectly. Jamukha and Temujin, later Genghis Khan, had been childhood friends who became blood brothers, sharing a bond considered sacred in Mongol culture. But ambition drove them apart, and Jamukha became Khan's greatest rival for control of the Mongol tribes. When finally captured in 1206, Jamukha requested an honorable death without bloodshed, as befitting Mongol royalty. Genghis Khan granted this request, but in the cruelest way possible. Jamukha's back was broken, slowly and methodically, ensuring he lived for hours in agony as his organs slowly failed, technically fulfilling the request for a bloodless death while maximizing suffering. The governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, who had killed the Mongol trade caravan and sparked the war with Khwarezm, received special attention. After the city fell, he was captured alive despite fighting until his last arrow was spent. Genghis Khan ordered molten silver to be poured into his eyes and ears, a death that combined symbolism with sadism. The silver represented the greed that had motivated him to rob the caravan, while the method ensured a slow, agonizing death as the metal burned through tissue and bone. Witnesses reported that his screams could be heard throughout the night, serving as a warning to any who might consider harming Mongol merchants. The fate of the assassins, Hashashin fortress of Alamut, demonstrates the Mongols' systematic approach to eliminating potential betrayal. When the fortress finally surrendered in 1256 to Hulagu Khan, following Genghis Khan's established protocols, the Mongols promised safety to those who surrendered. The assassin Grand Master, Rukn al-Din, was treated as an honored guest, even taken on a tour of Mongolia, but this was an elaborate deception. Once the Mongols had extracted from him the locations of all other assassin fortresses and the names of all members, they systematically executed every single assassin they could find, men, women, and children. Rukn al-Din himself was kicked to death by Mongol soldiers on a mountain road, his body left unburied for animals. Within his own family, Genghis Khan's punishments for perceived betrayal were equally merciless. When his eldest son, Jochi, was rumored to be planning independence, he died under mysterious circumstances. Many historians believe on Khan's orders. His brother, Kasar, suspected of disloyalty, was subjected to a mock execution where he was buried up to his neck and left for a day before being pardoned. This psychological torture left Kasar a broken man who never again showed any independence. Khan's own generals learned that even decades of loyal service meant nothing if suspicion of betrayal arose. The Mongol legal code, the Yasa, codified tortures for various forms of betrayal. Adultery with a Mongol woman meant death by being cut in half at the waist. A slow death as the upper body remained alive for minutes or hours. Theft from the Khan meant being stretched between horses until torn apart. But the most elaborate punishments were reserved for those who betrayed military intelligence. They would have their tongues cut out, their eyes gouged, their ears filled with molten lead, and their limbs broken, all while being kept alive with careful medical attention to prolong the agony for days or weeks. The psychological torture often preceded the physical. The Mongols would force condemned traitors to watch the execution of their entire family line, children, parents, siblings, cousins, before their own death. They would be made to participate in the executions, forced to strike blows against their loved ones. In one documented case, a Chinese general who defected back to the Song dynasty was captured and forced to watch as his sons were slowly flayed alive, their skin removed in strips while they still lived. He was then sewn into a fresh horsehide and left in the sun. As the hide dried and contracted, it slowly crushed him to death over several days. These elaborate punishments served a calculated purpose in Genghis Khan's empire of terror. Every torture was designed to be memorable, to create stories that would spread along trade routes and through military camps. The message was clear. Betraying the Mongols meant not just death but suffering beyond imagination, not just for the traitor but for everyone they loved. This created a paralysis of fear that helped a relatively small Mongol force control a vast empire. Cities would surrender rather than risk betrayal from within their walls, knowing that anyone who opened the gates to the Mongols would condemn the entire population to creative torments. Beyond these 6 major atrocities lies a broader pattern of calculated cruelty that defined the Mongol conquests. The psychological warfare employed by Genghis Khan was perhaps his most devastating weapon, more effective than his mounted archers, more destructive than his siege engines. He understood that fear could conquer cities before his armies arrived, that terror could break spirits more thoroughly than swords could break bodies. The systematic use of psychological torture created waves of trauma that rippled across continents and through centuries, leaving scars on the collective memory of entire civilizations. The Mongols pioneered the use of refugee columns as weapons of psychological warfare. After destroying a city, they would deliberately allow some survivors to escape, but only after subjecting them to horrific mutilations. They would cut off hands, gouge out eyes or brand faces, then drive these maimed survivors toward the next target city. These walking testimonies to Mongol cruelty would arrive days or weeks before the army, their very presence spreading panic. Cities would empty as populations fled, creating refugee crises that destabilized entire regions. The Mongols counted on this. Fleeing populations would strip areas of food, spread disease, and create chaos that made organized resistance impossible. The practice of counting kills through severed ears or heads created its own form of psychological terror. After battles, each Mongol warrior was required to present proof of their kills, usually the right ear of each victim. This led to massive piles of body parts displayed outside conquered cities. At Liegnitz in Poland in 1241, the Mongols filled 9 large sacks with ears cut from European knights and soldiers. These gruesome trophies would be displayed to ambassadors and envoys, a visceral demonstration of what awaited those who resisted. The sight of these mountains of human remains often convinced cities to surrender without fighting. Children were specifically targeted in Mongol psychological warfare. They understood that the destruction of children was the ultimate blow to any society's future and morale. In many conquered cities, the Mongols would gather all children under a certain height, roughly corresponding to age 10, and systematically execute them in front of their parents. They would sometimes force parents to choose which children would live and which would die, or make siblings fight to the death with the promise that the victor would be spared. These acts served no military purpose, but were designed to break the human spirit so completely that resistance became psychologically impossible. The Mongol treatment of religious leaders and intellectuals was calculated to destroy the spiritual and cultural backbone of conquered societies. They would force Buddhist monks to kill animals, violating their fundamental vows. Islamic scholars were made to burn Qurans or drink alcohol mixed with pig's blood. Christian priests were crucified on the doors of their own churches, but often the Mongols would spare one religious leader from each massacre, sending them to spread the word of what had happened. These traumatized survivors became unwitting agents of Mongol terror, their testimonies more effective than any threat. The environmental destruction wreaked by the Mongols was a form of warfare against future generations. In Iran and Central Asia, they destroyed underground irrigation systems called qanats that had been built over millennia. Without maintenance, these systems collapsed, turning fertile oases into permanent deserts. They would salt fields to prevent agriculture, poison wells with corpses and animal carcasses, and burn seed stores to ensure famine. Some regions in Central Asia and the Middle East still haven't recovered their pre-Mongol agricultural productivity. This wasn't collateral damage, but intentional. Genghis Khan famously declared he wanted to turn the farmland of North China into pasture for Mongol horses. The Mongol legal system institutionalized cruelty in ways that affected daily life throughout the empire. The yasa included provisions that seemed designed to create maximum suffering. Anyone who urinated in running water was to be executed. Stepping on the threshold of a Mongol's tent meant death. Offering food to a prisoner without permission from guards resulted in execution of both the giver and receiver. These laws created an atmosphere of constant fear where any action could result in death. The arbitrary nature of many laws meant that everyone lived in perpetual anxiety, never knowing what might trigger fatal punishment. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of Mongol rule was the corruption of local populations into collaborators. They would identify the most ambitious or desperate individuals in conquered territories and offer them positions of power in exchange for enforcing Mongol brutality on their own people. These collaborators often exceeded their masters in cruelty, trying to prove their loyalty. This created deep divisions within conquered societies, destroying social trust and creating cycles of revenge that lasted generations. The Mongols understood that a people who couldn't trust each other could never unite in rebellion. The long-term impact of Genghis Khan's cruelty extends far beyond the immediate devastation of his conquests. Modern genetic studies have revealed the biological legacy of Mongol sexual violence. An estimated 0.5% of the world's male population carries Y chromosomes directly descended from Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. This represents approximately 16 million men alive today. But this genetic marker tells only part of the story. Throughout the former Mongol Empire, genetic studies show massive population replacements and admixtures dating to the 13th century, evidence of the systematic rape and forced breeding that accompanied Mongol expansion. The demographic collapse caused by Mongol invasions altered the trajectory of human civilization. In China, the population fell from approximately 120 million to 60 million during the Mongol conquest, a loss of 50%. Iran's population didn't recover to pre-Mongol levels until the 20th century, 700 years later. The Russian principalities lost approximately 50% of their population, with some regions like Kiev losing up to 90% of their inhabitants. These weren't just numbers, they represented the complete destruction of accumulated human capital, knowledge, skills, and cultural traditions that had developed over millennia. The cultural dark age that followed Mongol destruction in many regions lasted centuries. The Islamic world, which had led humanity in science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, never fully recovered its position of intellectual leadership. The destruction of libraries, killing of scholars, and disruption of educational institutions created a knowledge vacuum. Mathematical techniques were lost. Astronomical observations disappeared, medical procedures forgotten. The translation movement that had preserved Greek and Roman knowledge while Europe was in its dark ages ended abruptly. The loss wasn't just of books, but of entire traditions of scholarship and methods of teaching that had been refined over centuries. The economic devastation had consequences that shaped global development for centuries. The Silk Road, which had been the primary artery of trade and cultural exchange between East and West, never fully recovered. Cities that had been major commercial centers became ghost towns. The sophisticated banking systems developed in the Islamic world were destroyed, setting back financial innovation by centuries. Agricultural areas that had supported dense populations through complex irrigation became permanent wastelands. Some historians argue that the economic center of gravity shifted permanently westward to Europe, partly because the traditional centers in Asia and the Middle East were so thoroughly destroyed by the Mongols. The psychological trauma embedded itself in the cultural DNA of affected populations. In Russian, Persian, Arabic and Chinese literature, the Mongol invasions became synonymous with ultimate catastrophe. Mothers would terrify children into obedience with threats that the Mongols would return. The phrase, "the Mongol terror," entered multiple languages as shorthand for unimaginable horror. This cultural trauma affected political development. Many societies embraced authoritarian rule as protection against external threats, stunting democratic development. The fear of invasion and massacre became a defining characteristic of national psyches from Eastern Europe to East Asia. The religious impact of Mongol atrocities created lasting schisms and transformations. The destruction of Baghdad and the killing of the Caliph ended the classical period of Islam, contributing to a turn toward more conservative, defensive interpretations. In Buddhism, the destruction of monasteries and libraries in Central Asia and India contributed to the religion's decline in its birthplace. Christianity in Asia, which had been growing along the Silk Road, was virtually eliminated outside of isolated pockets. The Mongols' religious tolerance, often praised by historians, was built on the ashes of destroyed religious institutions and the bones of murdered clergy. Modern archaeological evidence continues to reveal the extent of Mongol devastation. Aerial surveys show abandoned cities across Central Asia, their outlines visible in the desert where nothing has grown for 8 centuries. Soil samples from the period show dramatic spikes in lead and other metals, evidence of massive burning of cities. Tree ring data indicates significant reforestation in previously agricultural areas as farmland was abandoned. In some regions, archaeologists find a complete cessation of pottery styles, building techniques, and other cultural markers, evidence of populations that were entirely eliminated rather than conquered. The ecological impact of Mongol conquests can still be observed today. The destruction of irrigation systems in Iran and Central Asia created deserts that persist 8 centuries later. The burning of forests in China and Eastern Europe altered local climates. Some scientists have even suggested that the massive depopulation and subsequent reforestation caused by Mongol killings led to a measurable decrease in global CO2 levels in the 13th century, the only time in recorded history when human mass death significantly impacted atmospheric composition. The Mongols didn't just kill people, they altered the very landscape of continents in ways that still affect millions today. As we reach the end of this dark journey through history, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. Genghis Khan's legacy of cruelty has been systematically whitewashed by historians who prefer to focus on his military innovations. The religious tolerance of the Mongol Empire or the increased trade along the Silk Road. Museums display Mongol artifacts without mentioning the millions who died to create that empire. Academic conferences discuss Mongol administrative techniques without acknowledging that these systems were built on a foundation of unprecedented genocide. This selective memory is not just a disservice to history, it is a final cruelty to the victims whose suffering has been erased from our collective consciousness. The romanticization of Genghis Khan in popular culture represents a profound moral failure. He appears as a heroic figure in films, a strategic genius in video games, a visionary leader in business books. Mongolia erected a 131-foot statue of him in 2008, the largest equestrian statue in the world. His image appears on currency, vodka bottles, and tourist merchandise. Yet imagine if Germany erected a similar statue to Hitler, or if Cambodia celebrated Pol Pot as a national hero. The difference in our treatment reveals an uncomfortable bias. Ancient atrocities seem to matter less than modern ones, Asian victims less than European ones, pre-industrial genocide less than mechanized mass murder. The victims of Mongol atrocities have no memorials, no museums, no days of remembrance. The women who were systematically raped, the children who were slaughtered, the scholars who were executed, they exist only as statistics in academic papers, if they are mentioned at all. Their individual stories, their names, their hopes and dreams, their final moments of terror, all erased. We know intimate details about Genghis Khan's life, his strategies, his sayings, his laws, but of his millions of victims, we know almost nothing. This imbalance in historical memory perpetuates the injustice, granting immortality to the perpetrator while consigning the victims to oblivion. The argument that we must judge Genghis Khan by the standards of his time, rather than our own moral framework, deserves examination. Yes, the 13th century was violent, and yes, other conquerors committed atrocities. But even by medieval standards, the Mongol conquests were exceptional in their cruelty. Contemporary chroniclers from multiple cultures, Chinese, Persian, Arab, European, all expressed horror at Mongol practices. These were not modern observers imposing anachronistic values, but people of that era recognizing unprecedented evil. The Mongols themselves knew their actions were extreme. They cultivated that reputation deliberately. What does it mean for humanity that such cruelty could be not just perpetrated, but celebrated? The Mongol Empire demonstrates that under certain conditions, human beings can be transformed into instruments of almost unlimited cruelty. The ordinary Mongol warriors who carried out these atrocities were not inherently evil. They were fathers, brothers, sons who had been systematized into a machine of death. This reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and the power of ideology, authority, and group dynamics to override individual moral intuitions. The Mongol Empire was not an aberration, but a revelation of what humans are capable of when all moral restraints are removed. The lessons from this dark chapter of history remain urgently relevant. The techniques of terror pioneered by Genghis Khan, the use of rape as a weapon of war, the targeting of civilians to break morale, the destruction of cultural heritage to erase identity, continue to be employed in modern conflicts. The systematic dehumanization of enemies that made Mongol atrocities possible mirrors the propaganda techniques used to enable modern genocides. The efficiency with which the Mongols organized mass murder presaged the bureaucratization of death seen in the Holocaust and other 20th century genocides. Understanding this history is not about dwelling on ancient horrors, but recognizing patterns that continue to threaten human dignity and survival. Perhaps most disturbing is how success has sanitized Genghis Khan's legacy. Because he won, because his empire lasted, because his genetic line proliferated, history has gradually transformed him from a perpetrator of genocide into a great leader. This reveals a fundamental flaw in how we construct historical memory. We inherently favor winners, regardless of their methods. The Mongol Empire's administrative innovations, religious tolerance, and facilitation of trade are presented as achievements that somehow balance or even outweigh the millions of deaths. But can any achievement justify such suffering? Does success excuse genocide? These are not just historical questions, but moral challenges that every generation must confront. As this documentary draws to a close, we return to where we began. with the forgotten voices of the victims. Behind every statistic was a human being who experienced terror we can barely imagine. A mother watching her children murdered, a scholar seeing centuries of knowledge burned, a young woman facing a lifetime of sexual slavery, a farmer watching his life's work destroyed and knowing his family would starve. These were not abstract losses, but intimate personal tragedies multiplied millions of times over. Their suffering was not noble or meaningful. It was cruel, pointless, and preventable. They deserve more than to be forgotten, more than to be reduced to numbers in the story of someone else's greatness. They deserve to have their humanity recognized, their suffering acknowledged, and their memory preserved as a warning of what happens when power combines with cruelty and the world chooses to look away. The true crime of Genghis Khan was not just the millions he killed, but the human capacity for evil he revealed. A capacity that lies dormant in every society, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. May we never forget, and may we never allow such darkness to rise again.